Hello, good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's the Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where we shall be taking a look at the important articles which have appeared in today's newspaper, that is for 5th of September 2023 in the Delhi edition, and we shall be analyzing those articles in detail. So let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for. So in total, we are going to have a discussion for around 7 topics. Out of those, 3 are the topics that we are going to have a detailed discussion about. So the topics that we are going to analyze from your mains perspective as well. So that is, emerging countries need women-led climate action. This has appeared in the editorial section, that is page 8 of the newspaper. That is relevant for your GS paper 3 as well as for your essay paper. Oftentimes, you will find direct questions from this topic itself being framed into an essay or a GS3 kind of a question. Then opportune moment, it has also appeared in the editorial section of the newspaper, and this talks about the GST earnings, the GST revenues, and why now is the opportune time and the appropriate time to bring forward some amount of reforms and to simplify the tax structure of GST as well in order to improve the level of compliance. That will also be relevant for your GS paper 3. Then a detailed section has appeared in the newspaper about Aditya L1 mission. Now, even though we have studied a lot and you have basically come across the facts about Lagrange point, Aditya L1 mission when it was launched on 2nd of September, here in this article we talk in detail about what this particular mission is supposed to carry out as a process, the various different payloads which are included in that, and what will be the work of those particular payloads. With the help of certain animations, we will try to understand the aspects such as coronal mass ejection and also the impact of solar winds which are created on the Earth's surface. Then certain topics we are going to discuss for your prelims perspective. Exercise Trishul by the Indian Air Force. The Vikram Lander has successfully carried out a hop experiment. What is that hop experiment which was conducted successfully before putting the lander into sleep mode? Then the central bank digital currencies can make payments across the border much more efficient and the various implications of such digital currencies. And we are going to analyze one of the science articles where briefly we shall be focusing upon the topics which are relevant for your prelims. That is, what do we understand by Hubble's law? What do we understand by Hubble constant? What do we mean by redshift? So only those snippets which are relevant for the prelims is something that we are going to extract from this article. So let us start the discussion from the first topic of the day, and that is emerging countries need women-led climate action. So this is going to be relevant directly for your GS paper 3 as well as for your essay paper. Now, when we talk about climate change, it is one of those topics which is always in prominence nowadays. It is always directly or indirectly put into focus because the impact of climate change is something which is very visible to all of us. But when we talk about impact of climate change and when you imagine about impact of climate change, you think about unprecedented level of floods, droughts, landslide events, etc., causing massive disasters across the world. But here you have to understand that many of these disasters, they end up impacting the women folk at a much greater proportion as compared to the other sections of the society. And there have been various different researches and various different studies which have indicated the empirical evidence that how vulnerable sections, particularly the women and the girls, in the society, they are impacted due to climate change. So that is what this article is focusing about, and that is what we are going to analyze about. Now, when we talk about climate change, it is no longer a distant phenomenon which we are going to approach sometime in the future. Climate change and its impact is upon us. We are realizing its impact on a day-to-day basis. So when we talk about climate change, it is predicted, and as per a report by ILO, that is International Labour Organization, it is predicted that by the year 2030, there shall be a reduction of close to around 2.2% of the total man hours of work that we put in. So think about it, there will be a reduction of 2.2% of total working hours. Okay. Now, what this basically means is that, and why is there going to be a reduction in the total working hours? Because of the impact of climate change, you have unseasonal excessive rainfall, flooding, avalanches, landslides. Obviously, that causes a disruption. Your normal work habits won't continue after that. So that is why there will be a reduction. And this amounts in total to close to around 80 million full-time jobs. So at a time when the world is grappling with the issue of creation of more jobs, climate change alone can be responsible and accountable for the loss of close to around 8 crore full-time jobs out there. So that is why it is an impact. It is one of those phenomena which has to be taken seriously. When we talk about the various different types of migrations which happen, now migrations from one place to another, they can happen on a permanent or a semi-permanent basis. Now these migrations, they are influenced by economic factors, geographical factors, socio-cultural factors, etc. But climate change is emerging out to be one of the major factors which is driving migration patterns across the world. For example, if you consider, let's suppose any low-lying island region. Now, due to climate change, there has been frequent flooding, storm surges, tropical storms which have frequented these areas. So people, they are losing their livelihoods and they are forced to migrate to another country or some other region. Take the case of our own subcontinent. In our own subcontinent, you will observe that in the region of the low-lying terrain of Sundarban Delta, due to frequent flooding by the seawater and due to also storm surges brought during the tropical storms, seawater has entered multiple times into the farmlands and then eventually retreated back or evaporated. But whenever this event happens, that seawater, when it gets evaporated, it will leave behind the salt and thereby rendering these farmlands unutilizable. So again, people are forced to migrate from these areas. And if you consider in our states itself, take the case of the region, for example, Bundelkhand. Bundelkhand, which is a very dry region, which always suffers from scarcity of water, and there you have the Ken-Betwa interlinking of the river project which is being carried out to provide water into that region of Bundelkhand. Also, due to climate change, Bundelkhand is experiencing extraordinary span of dry conditions or drought-like conditions, which has led to multiple crop failures, and people and the farmers, they have been forced to migrate from there. So even as per the New York Declaration for Refugees, it was understood, refugees and migrants together, it was understood that climate change is going to be one of the major factors which will determine the migration pattern in the next century. And we are already upon that stage. Now, when this migration patterns, etc. happens, it is the women folk who are impacted. But how are they impacted and why they are impacted? Let us understand. First of all, as per the estimate, 80% of the displaced population due to climate-led disasters, they are women and children. Now you have to understand that close to around 60% of population in South Asia and Africa that is the 60% of the women population. Okay, when we talk about 60% of the population, we are talking about the women population. Now, that much amount of population is directly or indirectly linked to agricultural activities. And agriculture is one of those activities which is being impacted due to climate change because of excessive heavy amount of rainfall leading to the failure of the crops, followed by an excessive dry condition or drought-like season, again leading to failure of crops. So that is where these people or the labor that is impacted quite sufficiently. And it is a unique fact here, and in fact a paradoxical fact as well, if you can think about it in that terms, that of the 60% of the women who are indulged in the agricultural activities, only 10% of them have the ownership of any kind of land thereby. So there, they don't have the ownership, but they are supposed to earn from this medium of farming or agriculture. So whenever there is a failure, their income level dips and dips sufficiently. But also, due to climate change, there are certain factors again which are put at risk. For example, availability of drinking water. Now, when we talk about availability of drinking water, that is going to be a scarce resource. Whenever you have dry conditions or dry climate for a longer period of time, drinking water becomes a scarce resource. So, be it drinking water, be it cooking fuel, etc., it is the women folk, most often than not, who have to travel larger distances to get that access for the family. Right? And when they cover such larger distances, there also, in the way, they are prone to various different types of exploitations, trafficking, the sexual misconduct, etc., and the list simply goes on. So as compared to the male population, it is the female population who suffers much more due to the impact of climate change. Now also, because of climate change, the cleaner cooking fuels which are generally available, their accessibility is also denied. So in the kitchens, in the household, women folk, they are forced to work under very bad conditions, precarious conditions, so to say, where they are forced to inhale a lot of smoke. And that also significantly hampers their health condition. Now, these are how they are impacted directly. But when you have a climate-induced disaster, for example, what we have seen unfold in the region of Himachal Pradesh, or excessive amount of flooding which happened in Pakistan last year. Now, women and girls, they are the major refugees or migrants in that case. And they are the ones which constitute the majority of the displaced population. Now, once they are displaced from one area to another, their access to the basic necessities of life, basic health care, right? For example, the reproductive health care, the sexual health care, now that is denied to them. And it is in the face of this denial, they are forced to take a harder option many of the times, leading to a kind of an exploitation which is absolutely not desired. So that is where we have to cater to the demands of this woman and the larger women population. So here, what can be done going ahead and moving forward? First of all, when we talk about agriculture, and we have seen majority of the women are involved directly or indirectly in agricultural mechanisms, where they are working significantly harder, much harder than their comparative labor force in other sectors, but they are earning very, very less. It is that small amount of income which is providing them some amount of economic independence, economic freedom, which is very, very important for their empowerment in the society. Now, because agriculture is getting impacted due to climate change, so the requirement is to train these workforce into climate change resilient agricultural mechanisms. So, to train the workforce for climate change resilient agriculture. Which means what? What do we mean by climate change resilient agriculture? That means you carry out an agricultural mechanism or an agricultural methodology where you are not dependent on the climate anymore. Where, let's suppose, you prefer indigenous varieties of seeds who are much more tolerant to the changes in temperature and rainfall or precipitation conditions. Also, you carry out better method of providing irrigation, much more better conservation of water as well. For example, more crop per drop mechanism, where for each and every drop of water that you lay into the farmland, you are basically thinking about how much I can utilize it, how much I can recirculate it. Greater utility of organic and on-farm supply. So all these processes, it makes the agriculture much more resilient to any impact which shall be forced upon due to climate change. Then skilling and education of women. Many of the times it is the awareness which is lacking. awareness about whether they can be utilized or there is some other sector where they can have their labor force being deployed or they can utilize their own skills and talent. But for that, you need a greater level of skilling to be provided across the entire strata of the society as well. Then, utmost priority to healthcare, priority to healthcare. And this particularly the sexual and reproductive health. Okay? Health. Then after that, making them a part of the decision-making process. Decision-making process and decision-making organizations. Okay? Then after that, we can have another methodology where, let's suppose, all the countries and all the member nations of UN, they come together, they devise a standard operating procedure at the time of a disaster. Whenever we talk about disaster management, we talk about rescuing as many lives as possible, preventing the loss of life and property to as much extent as possible. So there needs to be a development of a standard operating procedure or a kind of a code which needs to be followed in all the various countries when it comes to disaster management, so as to prevent the exploitation of women, the displaced women and the girl population. They are not exploited at the hands of these opportunists and the social criminals out there. So devising a standard operating procedure for protection of women. Okay, so these are the areas where we can carry out some work in order to make their lives better. Overall, you have to understand, whenever you talk about the impact of climate change, first of all, when you compare it with the strata of the society, that is, when you compare it between the rich and the poor population, it is the poor which gets impacted at a much greater extent. The rich, they are able to always find an alternative. And there has been a detailed study carried out with this as well. And the detailed study was carried out compared to the Indian cities and the metropolitan cities, where it was found out that it was a poor population which would live close to the river banks of majority of the cities in the form of various different hutments, settlements, etc., slums, etc. Now, whenever you have the impact of climate change, the rivers, their movement is oftentimes interrupted. They flood very easily and also they recede as quickly as possible. So it is always the poorer section which will get impacted. Now, amongst the poorer sections of the society, when compared to men and women, it is the women which will get always impacted much more. And this is where you have to drive your answer from. So here you can also cite the examples of certain organizations. For example, you have the Self-Employed Women's Organization, which is basically a kind of an organization operating all across the country. It talks about teaching women the methodologies of climate change resilient agriculture in order to ensure that the economic process or the economic job that they are carrying out, they get perfect remuneration for that without getting impacted by climate change. So this is for agricultural skilling. Agri-skilling. Then, as a part of UNFCCC itself, you have the Gender and Climate Change Development Program that works for the entirety of South Asia, where you have a better gender parity in the decision-making bodies which is aimed at, so that eventually when a decision is taken, eventually when a decision is arrived at, it caters to the demand of the entirety of the population rather than only some sections of the population in itself. So these organizations can be cited as an example about the way forward, about what can be done going ahead, and you need to increase the gender parity, improve the gender parity in the various multilateral and international organizations in order to help the women folk. Now moving on to the second article. The second article is Opportune Moment. Again, this has appeared in the editorial section. This is going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. And this talks about the fact that how the GST collections and the GST revenue has been increasing as compared to last year. As compared to last year, if you consider the data pointers of last year, on an average every month, the GST revenue used to be close to around, on an average, rupees 1.5 lakh crore. Okay, that was last year. This year, however, for the first 5 months, of the financial year 2023-24, the average GST collections have indicated a sum of close to around 1.66 lakh crores, with a kind of an exception for the month of April, where it was around 1.87 lakh crore. But in general, this is for the 5 months of 2023-24. So what does that indicate? It tells us that the amount of GST revenue realization that is happening, that is improving on a day-to-day basis. The amount of revenue that we are generating from the various sources, we are getting much more efficient. But there are certain other nitty-gritties which have also been indicated. For example, that for the past couple of months, there has been a dip. However, that dip has been appended in terms of certain parameters. Let us take a detailed look into that. First of all, the points to note in the entirety: the average growth of 11.5% in the first 5 months of 23-24 was noted. Revenues from good imports rose 3% after 3 months of contraction. Goods import. Now, imported goods, there also you get some revenue, but imported goods, mostly they don't come under the category of necessary demand. It comes under the category of discretionary demand. Discretionary demand as in, you will buy those goods only if you require them. They are not a part of your day-to-day necessities of life. So it also indicates that it is the economically well-off section of the society which is again fueling this demand by this increasing revenue. So this means increasing discretionary demand. Or discretionary spend as well is something that we can write. Now, discretionary demand is not something that the poorer section of the society exercises. Poorer section oftentimes is entangled with fulfilling the requirements of the basic necessities of life itself. Then domestic demand as of now is fueling the growth in terms of even the GDP, even in terms of the GST revenue. So that means the growth in GST revenue that we are experiencing, that is going to be much more resilient. If it is completely dependent on external scenario and external imports exports, that means that external shocks, whenever they will happen, there can be a dip in GST revenue. But then because it is a domestic demand, it is going to sustain. That means it is going to be resilient. Now, on the face of it all, we are experiencing and facing an unprecedented inflation as a risk. Now, whenever you have inflation, so that means, and present condition of inflation is what? Where the food prices are particularly high, isn't it? So when the food prices, let's suppose, they go particularly higher, okay, when they go through the roof, then the larger section of the society, they will start saving on other materials in order to fulfill the requirement of the food. It is not as if someone will go out there to buy a refrigerator. If they don't have enough money to buy potatoes and tomatoes, they would go there to buy refrigerator because refrigerator is cheaper. That will never happen. Always food will be given a basic priority. So when the inflation is higher, then the other products, and the other consumable items, they get crowded out. So that means the GST realization in the coming days, if the inflation persists, that GST realization will come down. That is something we have already experienced in the past month. And going ahead, the only hope is that the festive season is something which is fast approaching. And it is during this festive season where always the demand again skyrockets. So all the hopes for the greater amount of GST revenue realization is pinned on the festive season. But it will take around 2 to 3 months to indicate that increase. But here you have to understand that overall there still has been an 11.5% of increase in revenue. And that is something worth appreciation. But why is there an increase in the overall revenue? What are the reasons for the same? So you have basically the mandatory e-invoicing for firms with an annual turnover of over rupees 5 crores. Now they have to mandatorily submit the e-invoicing, which earlier it was an option. It was also provided an exemption in many of the cases, which was utilized in a scrupulous manner to circumvent the requirements of GST filing. So that is why, and there has been a greater crackdown on evasions and fake registrations by the various different mechanisms, programs, initiatives launched. So that has brought about a greater amount of revenue realization, because people also have realized it is much better to pay the GST in itself rather than getting indulged in the various different types of searches, raids, etc. Then, excising loose ends in the trail tax. That GST is a kind of a value-added tax overall, so there is always a scope for refund as well. So that is where many of the loose ends meant that many of the people could escape without paying tax as well. So that has been strengthened with the help of machine learning and AI mechanism as well. But all of this has presented us with a very unique opportunity where we can actually go for certain much required reforms in the GST structure. Because you have to understand that GST was supposed to be, as it was envisioned, as it was envisaged, it was supposed to be a very simple tax structure. In many ways, yes, you can argue that it is indeed a simplified tax structure, but for many products and for many items, the GST rates still are very, very complicated, which doesn't make sense. The group of ministers, including the state finance ministers, which forms the group of ministers for GST Council, now way back in 2021, mid-2021 itself, they had recommended the fact that let's go for rationalization of these taxes, let's make it much more simplified, let's go for a much more uniformed tax rate as well. But again, in 2022, the tax realization was very less, and this year it has improved. So that signifies a better change and a better trend in the going ahead future as well, that sometime in the future we will just think of the year 2020, 2021 as a minor blip, and then again the GST realizations and revenues will give us the benefits. So now is the time to provide the reforms which are required and simplify and rationalize the complex multiple rates of the GST structure as was indicated way back in July 2021 itself. Now, it could also aid when you are rationalizing the GST structure, the tax regime in itself. That means certain products can get very cheap. Consumer items, some of them can get cheaper. Now, in the eye of increasing inflation, that will significantly help to increase your GST revenue as well, will provide relief to the consumers as well. And it should not be the aim, as per the article, the government should not aim to lower the GST rates immediately before election, because that is a long time away still, and it could involve a lot of hardships to the people involved as well. And the time is opportune to initiate the dialogue, at least at the ministerial level. Even if, let's suppose, you're not taking a decision immediately, at least if you initiate the dialogue, maybe sometime going ahead next year, you can rationalize it rather than setting up the entire council once again and repeating the entire process, which is going to take another 2 to 3 years. So we can kickstart the process from now itself. Okay? Now, coming to the third article, the third topic of the day, and that is Aditya L1, its functioning and purpose. Now, till now you have heard, or whichever article that you have been confronted with, you have been familiarized with the fact that India has launched the Aditya L1 mission to study the sun, the atmosphere of the sun, and the behavior of the sun, and it will be launched. It has already been launched. It will cruise for around 4 months to reach the Lagrange L1 point, where in that halo orbit, it will position itself to continuously be able to study the sun. Now, already at that point, you have one of the spacecrafts being operated by European Space Agency and NASA, which is also referred to as SOHO. That is Solar and Heliospheric Observatory. This is launched by European Space Agency, ESA, and NASA of United States. So this observatory is already carrying out the experiments of studying the sun for some time now. Now these small snippets, they will be relevant for your prelims as well. But here, in this article, we study about what is it exactly that Aditya L1 is supposed to do, what are the various payloads involved in that spacecraft, and what is their own individual action. So first of all, the basic of it. So the prime purpose is to study the corona. Now corona is the outer atmosphere of the sun, and corona represents a very unique feature. Unique feature in the sense that it represents very high temperature. Think about the anomaly in the sense that, let's suppose you have a bonfire, logs of wood that you have put on fire. Now, as you are closer to the fire, you feel that the temperature is higher. When you move away from the fire, from the bonfire, you feel that the temperature has reduced quite significantly, isn't it? But then, in the case of corona, corona is situated significantly away from the sun, close to around 1.3 to 1.5 of the solar radii, or even 1.05 of the solar radii. So there, despite the fact that on the sun's surface you have a temperature of close to around 5600 degrees Celsius or 5000 to 6000 degrees Celsius, on the region of corona, the temperature can exceed much higher, significantly higher than that. Now, why does that happen is a reason that the scientists of the world, they are still not aware of. Many of them, they have cited the existence of certain heat bombs which are discharged from the surface of the sun and which in a way explode around the region of corona farther away from the distance, and that is what creates that amount of heat. But it is still an unexplained mechanism that is still not verified. Overall, if you take a look at the corona, this feature that you observe, that is corona. When the sun is shining, so at that point of time, corona is not visible because of the bright light around the sun. It is only during eclipses where oftentimes you will be able to look at the corona as well. Many of the times what the physicists end up doing is that in the telescope, they attach a kind of a blockage so that the sun is not visible, the region around the sun is continuously visible. That in specialized instrument or modified instrument of a telescope, that is also what is referred to as coronagraph. Okay, and everything is being done to study the corona, but we have not been successful. So it is about 10 million times less dense than the sun's surface, and it makes the corona much less bright than the surface of the sun itself. So visible during eclipses or with the coronagraph. Now, there are also events such as the occurrence of sunspots. Now, this Aditya L1 mission is supposed to study the solar maxima and minima. Now, very briefly, I'll let you know what do we mean by solar maxima and minima. So, the sun in itself, from the ground surface, it appears to be largely static and it appears to be very stable. But then the solar activities, they suddenly increase quite significantly and reduce as well with an equivalently fast pace. Now this happens in an every 11-year cycle, what we refer to as a solar cycle. Solar cycle, where the solar activity goes to the maxima and then comes again to the minima. And this is an 11-year cycle. Okay. Now, during this 11-year cycle, whenever you have solar maxima, it has been observed during the solar maxima that the amount of activities are much more. The heat produced is also significantly higher in certain of those areas, and that leads to creation of lot of sunspots. Now, what are these sunspots? So sunspots, they are the areas where the magnetic field is almost 2500 times stronger as compared to the Earth itself, much higher than anywhere else on the sun. So as a result of that, and this is because of the heat produced after some time, that creates a concentration of certain amount of charged particles in a region, and that produces that increased magnetic field. So once the magnetic field increases, the density of the magnetic field lines will automatically increase, and that will reduce the density of the solar atmosphere in that region. Now, once the solar atmosphere reduces, that means the region starts becoming colder. And because it has got a kind of a magnetic anomaly associated, that means the heat from the inside won't be able to travel to the surface very efficiently. So that means these are the cooler regions of the sun. Now, during the time of this solar maxima is when you will observe a lot of these sunspots. Oftentimes they will appear in pairs, where you will have a deformed magnetic field existing between two of them. I will indicate to you, or I'll show you the image of that as well. But during solar maximum is when you will have a lot of these sunspots. While the visible wavelength that we utilize on the planet Earth, the visible wavelength of the sun remains largely consistent between a solar maxima and a solar minima. But it has been estimated that during the time of solar maxima, it is the ultraviolet rays of the sun whose proportion increases quite substantially and drastically. Now, ultraviolet rays of the sun which are emitted are absorbed largely by the Earth's atmosphere itself. In certain areas, they do happen to penetrate. So, we are not able to successfully measure the changes in the ultraviolet rays produced by the sun during the solar maxima events. So, this is something that Aditya L1 mission and the payload on them, they will study the excess ultraviolet rays, UV rays released. Okay. Now, there you have a different payload for that. We will talk about that payload as well. There is another thing that Aditya L1 is supposed to study about, and that is the coronal mass ejections and the solar winds. So oftentimes around the region of the sun surface, because of the existence of certain sunspots, now these are the areas of magnetic anomalies. So here, whenever magnetic anomalies happen, observe how the materials, they get twisted and turned due to that magnetic anomaly. Now, after a point of time, they are unable to hold themselves or attach themselves to the surface itself, and they are released with a very high velocity oftentimes, sometimes even a slow velocity, but sometimes a velocity of close to around 3000 km per second as well. And they are released with that speed, and they travel through the solar system. And they travel in many of the times as solar winds as well. Okay, so CMEs or coronal mass ejections are large expulsions of plasma and magnetic field from the sun's atmosphere, that is the region of the corona. And the solar winds, they are the ever prevalent charged particles and plasma which keep on getting emitted from the sun and which move through the solar system with an extraordinary speed. But then, why do we need to study that? What is the requirement of that? So first of all, you have to understand, I'll take you immediately to the impact first of all. So when you have any of these emissions or expulsions which happen, now these charged particles, they are directed with a greater velocity upon to the various different planets. Now they hit the planet's atmosphere. In many of the areas, the planet's atmosphere is shielded by the magnetosphere of the Earth itself, what we refer to as geomagnetism. But in areas of weaker magnetic field, for example, around the northern and the southern poles, that is where these charged particles, they enter into the atmosphere. When they enter into the atmosphere, they do provide some amount of charge to the gases as well, leading to the beautiful bright lights that you see. in the polar region, which we talk about as the auroras or the northern and the southern lights. So they end up creating auroras, right? That is aurora borealis or northern lights in the northern hemisphere or northern lights. Okay, and that is in the northern hemisphere, and also aurora australis in the southern hemisphere. This happens because of the charged particles hitting the atmosphere. Now, on the face of it, you might think that fair enough, why do we need to get concerned about that? It is only the northern and the southern polar region which are experiencing this, and anyways the auroras or the northern and southern lights, they are a beautiful phenomena. Why should we worry about that? But it is in these regions where they will also impact the satellite systems. Many of the satellites, they can be rendered unutilizable if they impact the pure and the sheer velocity as well as the aftermath of a solar wind. Recently, that is in the recent past, we have had a solar wind hitting the planet's atmosphere. So the communication systems, they get disrupted. Okay, the satellite systems, they get disrupted. The GPS navigation that we all rely upon, that will surely get disrupted. Then the electrical supply in the various different power grids, they are impacted many of the times, leading to short circuit and failure worth crores of rupees. And obviously you have to keep in mind the space assets as well. That loss is also quite significant in terms of monetary loss involved. Now here, we come back to the payloads involved in Aditya L1 mission. So here you observe the SOOT payload. That is the Solar Ultraviolet Imaging Telescope to study the variations in ultraviolet rays when? During solar maxima. Okay. Now various private players, along with the guidance of ISRO, they have been involved in manufacturing of this suit. It has taken close to around 10 years to develop. So this is a very important equipment which will study the ultraviolet rays variation emitted from the sun, which we have not been able to gauge from the planet surface itself. Other than that, there will be two other of these payloads, that is solar low energy X-ray spectrometer and high energy L1 orbiting X-ray spectrometer. This is also going to study the behavior during the solar minima and maxima. They are also going to study the behavior of the corona as well. Okay, so responsible for behavior of sun during minima and maxima. Okay, and also here you have visible emission line chronograph, significantly involved for the study of the corona itself. Then you have aspects and the PAPA module, that is Aditya Solar Wind Particle Experiment and Plasma Analyzer package for Aditya. This is supposed to study the CME, the coronal mass ejection, and the solar winds. The amount of charged particles which are released during the solar winds. Now, the solar winds, when they are released, so if you can imagine about it on a smaller scale, if you can think about it, let's suppose this is the sun. Now, the solar winds and the particles which are released, for example, let's suppose the charged particles are released. Now, these charged particles, they undergo a kind of an angular shift, right? Deviating around the planet's magnetically weaker areas. So what that angular shift is going to be about? How much is it going to be impacted by the position of the sun or the position of the earth, the tilt of the earth on its axis? All of that will be analyzed by these two modules as well. And it is also pertinent to understand the frequency at which these solar winds are consistently emitted. Overall, you also need to be aware, because this mission is going to study about the solar winds, about the impact of it. So one, we have seen creation of the northern and the southern lights. Second, damage to satellite and communication. Okay. Then you will have damage to space assets, okay. Then after that, damage to grids, electrical grids. So all these are the major points of concern and the impact. So overall, what is it that we have studied in this particular topic? This is a topic that we have covered in significant detail, and that is the requirement of the exam as well. So UPSC is never going to ask you the question that after Chandrayaan 3, which is the mission that was launched by ISRO? That kind of question will never be asked by UPSC. So UPSC will ask you that what are the various different instruments on board Aditya L1? What is their important role involved and why they are being deployed? That is to understand the solar behavior so that we can save ourselves from these particular impacts overall. Because if you think about ISRO in itself, ISRO devises or houses close to around 50,000 crore worth of space assets across the planet. So it will be very helpful to protect our space assets, to understand the behavior of the sun, and that is something which the world has still not understood in greater detail. Now let us take a look at few of the articles in a brief manner relevant only for your prelims examination. So here, Indian Air Force begins the Western Air Command's annual exercise. Now this has been carried out after a long time. This is what is referred to as exercise Trishul. It is an annual training exercise. Training exercise. Of which? Of the Indian Air Force. Western Command. Okay. It had not been carried out for some time because of the events which unfolded around the region of Galwan and along the Chinese border. So there was a kind of a brief delay and a brief pause in that. Even now, when this exercise is being carried out, there will be interruption during the time of the G20 summit in order to increase the security around the entirety of the venue and the region. But other than that, this will be a massive fleet training exercise where the capacity increase is being talked about, in the sense that when we talk about the Air Force, when you think about or imagine about Air Force, all that you think about is fighter jets bombing various regions. But the Air Force's significant amount of utility comes in taking the troops to the battlefield itself. For example, during the Galwan clash, Air Force, with the help of its transport aircraft fleet, managed to deploy close to around 8,000 troops, more than around 3,000 vehicles, lot of the tanks as well, up till the forward border reaches of the region of Ladakh. And that is a work which only Air Force can carry out. So that is where you need to have the increased fleet capacity exercise being carried out periodically. So that exercise Trishul will be relevant for your prelims. Then Vikram Lander does a hop, goes to sleep. Good night till September 22. Now, we all knew that the Chandrayaan 3 mission, including the Pragyan rover as well as the Vikram Lander, they had a lifespan or a capacity of one lunar day, that is 14 Earth days overall. And that is because they were deployed with the help of the solar panels is how they could work, right? And that was the only source of energy. Now, the moon, due to its rotation, has now come into the phase for the next 14 days or one lunar day where it will be hidden from the sun. So these instruments won't get any amount of required sunshine. So that is why they have been put to sleep. But before putting them to sleep, first of all, the Pragyan rover was parked very carefully and all the batteries were recharged so as with a hope that maybe on 22nd of September again, we might send a signal, and we will send a signal to them. And if the batteries are still operating, if the instrument is still operating, despite experiencing sub-zero temperature for these 14 days, then it might come back to life again and carry out with its experimental work. But before that, something very monumental happened with the help of the Vikram Lander. That is, the Vikram Lander managed to fire its engines, managed to lift itself off the lunar surface, for around 40 centimeter height and then again land around 30 to 40 centimeter away from the original landing site. A video of that has also been released by ISRO. Now this marks the first launch of any vehicle by India in the outer space, right? Understand this sentence carefully. It marks the first launch of any Indian spacecraft from the outer space, in the sense that till now the launches that you have seen the launches happening from the planet's surface. But this launch, even though for a brief moment of and a brief distance of 40 centimeter from the surface, that has happened on the lunar surface. So what it indicates is a kind of a scientific feat and an achievement where now the scientists can have an ambition. They can think about retrieving samples from the moon in the next missions, where if the lander is able to successfully lift itself off the lunar surface, very well it can come back to the planet Earth as well, because the lunar gravitational pull is not that strong. So that brings about the quest for the human space flight as well, and the human lunar missions as well. So it is a monumentous feat for ISRO and the Chandrayaan-3 mission. This kind of a launch was for the first time carried out way back in 1967 by NASA's Surveyor 6. And that managed to lift itself off the ground for close to around 8 to 9 meters. But then that provided them with the basic idea about how, if we send the humans to moon, can we bring them back by launching them from the lunar surface as well. So now that the Vikram Lander and the Pragyan rover have been put to sleep, it is expected that on September 22, given that their batteries are charged and given that they survive close to around minus 100 degrees Celsius temperature, they will again wake up, and that will be again a monumentous feat. Coming to the portion of the business news, and that is the central bank digital currency can make payments across the borders efficient as indicated by the RBI governor. Now the central bank digital currency, it is a kind of a digital currency introduced by the central banks, which is being done by various central banks across the world as well. Now, what can be its benefits is a kind of a question that can be apparent in the prelims examination. So what are the benefits associated? First of all, if you have the central bank digital currency, now you can make cross-border payments as well. Let's suppose you go to Sri Lanka or you go to any other country. Now, if they allow you to continue with that form of payment, you can make that payment seamlessly without much time delay as well, and it will be easily processed there as well. So there will be some amount of cost saving in terms of logistics. So it will be efficient, right? It can protect you because the central banks are dealing directly, so protects you against currency fluctuations, protection against exchange rate fluctuations, okay, development of local foreign exchange and capital market, of local forex market, okay. It can also help withstand the global supply shocks by allowing a direct payment, withstand global supply shocks. So these are the benefits which can be accrued due to adoption of the central bank digital currency. Now, how it is relevant for your prelims, what kind of question can be framed? So oftentimes you would have come across the type of questions that take or analyze the following statements, which of them can be thought to be the benefit of the central bank digital currency. So that is where you have to keep these points in mind. Overall, it will increase the efficiency and the utilizability across the various sectors and dimensions as well. Coming to the last article, that is a radical idea to settle the universe expansion dispute. Now this is a very long article which has appeared in the science section. It talks about the various mechanisms and the newer methodologies by which you can calculate Hubble constant, you can verify the Hubble's law, etc. But don't indulge yourself, or not required for the examination to go into such depths that how you can calculate Hubble constant, etc. That is never going to be relevant for your examination. What is going to be relevant is, what do you understand by Hubble constant? What do you understand by redshift? That will be relevant. So here, first of all, Edwin Hubble, way back in 1929, Edwin Hubble was basically an American astronomer. So there, Edwin Hubble provided for the first time a theory which also managed to validate the Big Bang theory, because Edwin Hubble, with the help of a telescope, he observed that the existing stars and the existing celestial objects that you see around you, they are moving away from each other. They are consistently expanding, and that means the universe is expanding. And that formed the basis to prove the Big Bang theory as well, because Big Bang theory works on what principle? That close to around 13.8 billion years back, everything around the universe was concised into a very small mass, and that exploded and increased quite significantly over a period of time. So he provided the theory of expanding universe. Okay. Now, along with Lemaitre, now Lemaitre and Gamow were the ones who were responsible for provision of the Big Bang theory. Now, Edwin Hubble, along with Lemaitre, provided the Hubble law, which talks about the rate of expansion of the universe, and that is based upon the Hubble constant. So what is this Hubble constant? So Hubble constant is defined as the unit of measurement which is used for describing the expansion of the universe. It is 160 kilometer per second per million light years, right? That is per million light years. So light years is a unit of distance, isn't it? So this is your speed. So as you move higher up into the distance, it is at that rate that the universe is expanding continuously. Now, after the Big Bang theory, the universe started to expand with an extraordinary amount of speed, much faster than the speed of light as well. Now, it was after some time that the speed of expansion reduced, but due to dark energy, again that rate of expansion increased quite substantially. So that has been used by the various astronomers and the scientists to understand the condition of the early universe. And that is where Hubble constant is relevant. Then Edwin Hubble managed to conclude or come to the theory of expanding universe by measuring the redshift. Now what is the redshift? So redshift, the name accounts for from the point of the wavelength. Now, whenever white light is emitted, all the celestial objects, they emit a kind of a white light. Now, when the white light is emitted, it is emitted in various different wavelengths. That is violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. Okay, so this represents a long wavelength. This indicates ultraviolet is the wavelength below that, so this indicates a shorter wavelength. Okay, so here this red is significant of the, or is something which signifies the long wavelength. So whenever you have an object which moves away, it gives you an idea of that with the help of the wavelength that is emitted, that we refer to as the redshift. So by measuring these longer wavelengths and the shift, we get an idea about how far the object is moving. So whenever an object is moving, it indicates moving away from you. That is, it will always indicate a redshift. Whenever an object is coming closer to you, it is referred to as a negative redshift, or what is also referred to as a blue shift or a violet shift overall. Okay, so these are few of the technical parameters that you can familiarize yourself for the portion of the prelims. Now, coming to the questions. So, what is a Lagrange point? Discuss the role of Aditya L1 mission by highlighting the scientific experiments to be carried out by the spacecraft. Now, This is an answer that you can also write or frame for 15 marks or 250 words. So what is a Lagrange point? It is that point between any two celestial objects where the gravitational push and pull, they end up forming a kind of an equilibrium, right? You can give the example of the Lagrange point around the or in between Earth and the Sun, where you can indicate the 5 different Lagrange points, and you can indicate L1 that will lie between Earth and the Sun. So that will be your introduction. Then the role of Aditya L1 mission. So talk about that, how corona is an inexplicable phenomena in itself. So it is there to study the coronal behavior, and that is where you have the deployment of payload like suit, and the spectrometers, the high energy, low energy spectrometers as well. What is their role? Then the chronograph which is there, what is their role? Then you talk about the various modules to study about the plasma and the solar wind, why that needs to be studied, what is the impact of that. With the help of the image, you can always signify that and get a good marks. This is a kind of a question that you can easily expect in GS paper 3. Now, another kind of question which I told you can be directly framed from the topic: discuss the impact of climate change on women in the society. Briefly elaborate the incidence of impact in developing and underdeveloped nations. So here you talk about that how greater amount of population is involved in agriculture. Now in underdeveloped and developing nations, it is the women who have to cater for the collection of the fuel material, collection of drinking water supply. Due to climate change, oftentimes they have to walk for a far away distance. That creates grievous injuries, and that makes them prone to various forms of exploitation, trafficking as well. Then climate change induced disasters, that brings about a certain change where their accessibility to health, their accessibility to employment, education, everything is hampered. So women are at the receiving end. That is something you have to validate. At the end of it, you can provide in a couple of sentences about the way forward as well. So that brings into the light the requirement of women in greater population, in greater numbers in the decision-making process as well. So with that, you can end the answer as well. So that will be all for our discussion today. Till we meet again, take care of yourself. And by the way, I would suggest to you that please don't forget to go on our Telegram channel. Please try to take a look at the multiple choice questions which can be framed from the topic in order to assess your level of understanding. So till we meet again, do take care of yourself. If you like the content, please don't forget to click on the like, share and subscribe button. Thank you. Goodbye.